It is just after 4 o'clock. People are still joining us, but I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome you all this afternoon to the session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we focus on a new book by Frank Costigliola entitled Kennan, A Life Between Worlds, published just several weeks ago by Princeton University Press. Our discussants this afternoon are Beverly Gage and Barbara Keyes. I'm Eric Arneson from the George Washington University, co-chair of the Washington History Seminar, along with my colleague and fellow co-chair, Christian Osterman of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative and nonpartisan venture of the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program and the American Historical Association. And over the past decade, the seminar has been meeting weekly in pre-COVID times in person at the Wilson Center, and since the pandemic and I guess post-pandemic era here in the virtual realm. I should note today's session is also being sponsored by the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. If you have your calendars out, please take note. Next Monday, the Washington History Seminar features Heather Hendershot's When the News Broke, Chicago 1968, and the Polarizing of America, a book that will be published, well, next week. We'd like to recognize two people whose behind-the-scenes efforts make these seminars possible, Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the American Historical Association. And on the logistics front, please note that today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, we ask those of you with questions to use the raise hand function or the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll call on as many folks as we can. And with those preliminaries out of the way, let's get the seminar underway. Christian, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Eric. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Frank Costigliola to the Washington History Seminar, introduce him for the launch of his new book, Kennan A Life Between Worlds. Frank Costigliola received his BA from Hamilton College in 1968 and a PhD from Cornell in 1973. He is the author and editor of 7 books, including the Kennan Diaries, published by Norton in 2014. And he has received fellowships from the NEH, the Guggenheim Foundation, the Institute for Advanced Studies, and the Norwegian Nobel Institute, where we shared neighboring offices. He is currently the Board of Trustees Distinguished Professor at the University of Connecticut. He raises grass-fed Devon cattle on a 200-acre farm in Storrs, Connecticut. And it's, again, a great delight to welcome him to the seminar to talk about his new book, Kennan, A Life Between Worlds. Frank, Zoom room is all yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Christian. Thank you, Eric Arneson, for having me here. Thanks to the Wilson Center, and thanks to the American Historical Association. I'm honored to participate in this forum with such distinguished scholars who have each, like George F. Kennan, navigated between different worlds. Beverly Gage's biography of J. Edgar Hoover integrates the personal and political elements in Hoover's life. She analyzes how an intensely private man cultivated his public persona while helping shape the modern American state. Barbara Keyes' trademark is an astonishing breadth of scholarship, from sports history to studies of human rights and emotions to how Henry Kissinger has cultivated his superhero status. Christian Osterman has juggled the writing of important scholarship on German history with administration of institutions key to the production and dissemination of history, such as the one we're presently involved with. For his part, Kennan's straddling of different worlds came at a cost. He habitually felt betwixt and between. It is telling how often and in how many different contexts Kennan used the word bewildered to describe himself. The word bewildered seemed apt to him for both its literal sense, being lost in a pathless place, and its figurative sense, feeling surprised or stunned. Kennan regarded himself as a person out of his time. He mused that he might have been a better fit for the 18th century. He idealized an idyllic America that had never really existed. He failed to completely shed ugly prejudices absorbed in the early 20th century. Nevertheless, it is precisely Kennan's ill adjustment to modern America that gifted him with piercing insights, some relevant even today. He habitually questioned what most people simply accept. Kennan stubbornly did what intellectuals should do, think otherwise. The foundational trauma of George's life condemned him to a boyhood spent between worlds. The painful story that he could not refrain from telling and retelling in his memoir to his authorized biographer, to his children, and to close friends was that he had lost his mother at the age of 2 months. He grew up having to navigate between two households divided by class, culture, and temperament. His mother, Florence James, stemmed from a family of upwardly mobile Milwaukee gentry. Florence's father had run off to sea as a 13-year-old boy, had ventures crisscrossing the 7 seas, and then came back and founded a successful insurance company. The Jameses were wealthy and socially confident. They were doers rather than thinkers. Upon the death of Florence, her brother Alfred and his wife Nellie took it upon themselves to help raise George and his 3 older sisters. Charlie, the son of Uncle Alfred and Aunt Nellie, became George's best friend. The Jameses had little respect for George's father, Kossuth Kent Kennan, a shy, brooding, socially awkward man who was considerably older than Florence. In terms of manner and values, Kent, born in 1851, harked back to the 19th century. He started out as a Wisconsin farm boy who earned his way through college by doing chores before dawn. He became a lawyer and then grew interested in the income tax, developed in Germany, but not yet constitutionally permitted in the United States. Kent testified before the U.S. Congress in hearings that led to the passage of the 16th Amendment. The key point here is that while Kent Kennan ranked as a distinguished tax lawyer, he was even more distinctive for his disinterest or inability in making money from his expertise. During the years that George was growing up, 1904 to 25, Kent eked out only a meager living as a lawyer. He depended for most of the household expenses on income that accrued from the substantial inheritance that George and his 3 older sisters had gotten from their mother and from their grandparents. Uncle Alfred, who like Florence's parents, had suspected Kent of being interested in Florence primarily for her money, despised Kent for not earning enough to support his own children. George spent considerable time with the Jameses, who adored him. While loving his father and his sisters, the young boy was glad to get away from his stepmother, Louise, a woman liked by none of the Kennan children. When George reached 13, Kent and Louise, his father and stepmother, ignoring the objections of the James family, sent George, a well-behaved adolescent, off to St. John's, a military boarding school specializing in problem boys. Younger and smaller than that of the other students, in fact, he had to skip a grade to go there. Smaller than the other students, George was at first bullied. Learning that George was afraid of snakes, the older boys shoved serpents down his back. St. John's was run by a domineering, physically brutal disciplinarian, Duke Smith. Years later, George, in times of great stress, would hear an inner, distinctly masculine voice sounding much like Duke Smith, commanding him to suck it up and act tough. Countering this disciplining voice was another internal impulse. George would assure himself that he deserved and should seek out some feminine inflicted solace, whether from nurses in a hospital, his female doctor, whom he stayed with, who became his family doctor for decades, his female confidant on the policy planning staff, or some romantic interest. Young Kennan was also betwixt and between when it came to finances. While George possessed significant inherited wealth, he did not know that. Not even at Princeton, where inherited money was the coin of the realm. Upon reaching 21 years of age, he learned of the full extent of his inheritance. He entrusted the funds to his brother-in-law, a stockbroker. Without George's approval, the brother-in-law speculated with the money, and by 1932 had lost it all in the Depression. A year later, by which time Kennan had become a foreign service officer, his salary was cut as part of FDR's initial economy drive. This in-between experience of having money but not knowing it, of gaining an inheritance and then losing it, of getting a paycheck and then suffering a pay cut, infused Kennan with insecurity about money. He would always remain anxious about not having enough, his children would recall. Not trusting paper assets or the security of a paid job, he and his wife Annalisa would in 1942 buy a 250-acre farm as a financial anchor. In later years, he would keep part of his savings in physical gold, stored in a bank vault in New York City. Kennan theorized his feelings of being betwixt and between. At Princeton, he framed his inner struggle as pitting what he called convention against what he called unconvention. Convention meant adhering to duty, staying in school and pursuing a career. Unconvention signified escape, dropping out, writing a novel, and working as a deckhand on a tramp steamer, which he fantasized about. A few years later, recovering in Vienna from a physical and emotional breakdown in Moscow, Kennan read Freud and adopted the psychiatrist's discourse. As he now framed it, Eros signified nature and emotion. Pitted against Eros was civilization, which signified society and reason. Kennan believed that if a man, and he nearly always regarded the male gender as normative, if a man got caught between the cogs of nature and those of society, he would be rubbed to pieces. Kennan regarded the libido, Eros, as the control switch for vitality, emotional expression, and aesthetic creativity. While inciting chaos, the erotic force also enabled escape from deadly boredom. As Kennan saw it, civilization entailed the bourgeois or communist order that kept diplomatic channels humming, trains running, and society functioning. Eros enabled not only art, creativity, and imagination, but also an enticing immersion and obliteration of the self. Even as his career in the State Department advanced, Kennan at times broke down, literally collapsed in order to break free. He would check himself into a hospital, there to be cared for by attentive women dressed in white. He explicitly linked this urge to his experience as an infant in the care of hired nurses, also dressed in white. For most of his days, however, Kennan was driven by a fierce work ethic. Through long hours and superior ability, he rose in the State Department faster than anyone in his age cohort. In 1946-47, he would leap into prominence by means of two provocative documents, the long telegram of February 1946 and the Mr. X article published in Foreign Affairs in July 1947. In crafting these two manifestos calling for the containment of the Soviet Union, Kennan integrated creativity and order, emotion and reason. Much of the force behind these political statements came from Kennan's personal anguish. After his first tour in Russia in 1933-37, Kennan returned in July 1944. Walking the streets of Moscow, I react intensely to everything I see and hear, he marveled. Russia seems poignantly familiar to me, as though I had lived here in childhood. I feel immensely at home among these people. He delighted in rubbing elbows with the Russians in the streets, breathing in their touching smells. The sensory excitement kindled a longing for immersion and transcendence. If only, he wrote, I could get deeper into Russia, I might come face to face with that indefinable something so full of promise and meaning that I've always felt to be just around the corner. In Russia, then, shimmered something so wonderful that it seemed literally indefinable. Such reverie was cut short, however, by the harsh reality that the Soviet secret police punished as a crime contact with foreigners such as Kennan. Having to accept that I will never be able to be a part of them was a bitter pill for him to swallow. The painful separation forced by the Soviet police state intensified, did not create, but intensified Kennan's objections to the Kremlin's control over Eastern Europe. He saw the Red Armies move into Poland and other states as not just extinguishing national independence, but also as extending the brutal isolation enforced by Stalin's secret police. Kennan had experienced Soviet terror up close. Back in 1937 in Moscow, he had grown furious as Stalin's purges devoured Russians he had come to admire, from the doctor who had saved the life of his infant daughter to Karl Radek, who had jousted with Kennan at parties in the U.S. Embassy. During Radek's show trial, Kennan spent his days whispering a translation of the proceedings into the ear of the U.S. ambassador and his nights writing up reports for Washington. He observed the melodrama so closely that he picked up on typos in the transcripts published in the Soviet press. Kennan's personal trauma from the purges would haunt him the rest of his life. Also fueling Kennan's dictating the long telegram was his anger at Washington, which had largely ignored his reports sent from Moscow. He resented not being invited to the Yalta conference. Now, on February 22nd, 1946, the Friday of a holiday weekend, Kennan lay in bed with the flu and in a sour mood. In response to a State Department request for information about the Kremlin, he exploded. He dictated a 5,500-word telegram, the longest ever sent to the department. In July 1947, he would publish a similar warning about the Soviet menace in an anonymous article in Foreign Affairs. These manifestos packed such influence because they convincingly offered an attractive alternative to both appeasement and war. Their pervasive punch illustrated Kennan's ability to use a matter-of-fact tone and evocative words to spark emotion in the name of cool realism. In an oft-quoted sentence in the long telegram, Kennan asserted that in the Soviet Union, quote, "We have a political force committed fanatically to the belief that with the US, there can be no permanent modus vivendi, that it is desirable and necessary that the internal harmony of our society be disrupted, that our traditional way of life be destroyed, and the international authority of our state be broken if Soviet power is to be secure." How precisely this machine-like political force was going to actually achieve these expansive aims, a problem obscured by Kennan's use of the passive voice, is the question that Kennan did not address and that most readers of the long telegram have not asked. The force of these two manifestos fueled Kennan's rise in little more than a year, from an obscure diplomat in far-off Moscow to founding director of the policy planning staff of the State Department with an office next door to the Secretary of State. Kennan's purview at age 43 was planning for the entirety of U.S. foreign policy. When a colleague mentioned to Undersecretary of State Dean Acheson that a man like Kennan would be a good candidate for the policy planning staff, Acheson snapped back, a man like Kennan, there's no one like Kennan. For a brief, shining moment, from late 46 through 1948, Kennan stood not betwixt and between, but rather at the center of U.S. power. Even at the height of his influence, however, Kennan and his wife, Annalisa, remained in some ways unconventional. Weekends they spent not at Washington parties, but rather at their farm in East Berlin, Pennsylvania. Visiting dignitaries could discuss foreign policy with Kennan, but they had to do so while helping fix the trough in the pigsty, literally, uprooting the burdocks, or otherwise making themselves useful. Kennan's moment in the sun passed, because while he had convinced many of the necessity to contain rather than negotiate with the Soviet Union, he had not totally convinced himself. As early as February 1948, only 6 months after the publication of the Mr. X article, Kennan was already musing about talks with the Kremlin, leading to a mutual military pullback from divided Germany. Though thwarted by Cold War tensions, this February 1948 proposal marked the beginning of Kennan's persistent, often poignant, and sometimes tragic efforts over the next 4 decades to ease the Cold War. He came to regard the containment doctrine as an albatross around his neck. For decades, Kennan denied that he had helped instigate the militarization of the Cold War by depicting the Soviet threat in such dire terms. He had meant containment to be pursued only through economic and political measures, such as the Marshall Plan, he insisted. Only in 1996, at age 92, in a television interview with David Gergen, did Kennan acknowledge that he should have been explicit back in 1946-47 that Moscow did not present a serious military threat. In terms of the rubric of grand strategy, Kennan's work from 1946 through 49 secured his perch in the pantheon of conventional American grand strategists. Kennan himself, however, downplayed the terminology. In a note to himself, he penned in 1946, dropped the word grand. After 1949, Kennan urged a strategy that was, in the context of the Cold War, unconventional, namely serious diplomacy. In feeling such powerful empathy for the Russian people, Kennan could not help but develop insight into the perspective of the Russian masters in the Kremlin. Hence, again and again, he discerned opportunities for patient negotiations and eventual compromise. Kennan regarded containment as an if-then proposition. Once the Soviets were contained, Washington should negotiate an easing of tension. By contrast, Acheson, Dulles, and other Cold Warriors expected the conflict to continue until Moscow's unconditional surrender. Kennan is most famous for his prediction in 1947 that the Soviet Union would eventually collapse. A year later, he warned that no successor Russian government would ever permanently accept the independence of Ukraine. However correct he may have been about the Russians, Kennan grievously underestimated the power of Ukrainian nationalism. After the Cold War ended, Kennan, now in his 90s, cautioned the Clinton administration that expanding NATO eastward would undermine Moscow's fragile democracy while stimulating anti-Western feelings and militarism in Russia. Extending NATO eastward would also redraw a line between East and West, instigate a Cold War, and perhaps spark a military conflict, Kennan warned. On another occasion, Kennan warned about the consequences of the U.S. becoming economically dependent on China or trying to stymie Chinese nationalism. It's easy, very easy, but also short-sighted to dismiss Kennan as an oddball who chanced upon just one good idea, containment of the Soviet Union. Though some of his vision was blinkered by prejudices, Kennan was also gifted with brilliant prescience in a variety of areas. He ranks as an early environmentalist who deplored the spoliation of woodlands, farmland, and the seas. In 1970, he proposed an international environmental watchdog group that could, he hoped, evolve into a global environmental protection agency. Such an environmental crusade, he hoped, could draw focus and resources away from the Cold War. Kennan picked up on the first reports of global warming. He criticized the sacrificing of what he regarded as the sacrificing of vast swaths of cities as well as of rural landscapes to accommodate the automobile. Far better than individualized, atomized travel, Kennan insisted, would be a dense network of easy-to-use rail links that would facilitate transportation while fostering community. So it would foster community because people would tend to live near the rail station rather than spreading out in every direction. Never a fan of the unregulated free market, Kennan urged that disruptive new technologies be vetted and licensed before being marketed. Think here, ChatGPT. Kennan urged the establishment of a council of state of plausibly disinterested citizens to advise the federal government and the nation. Well, it's certainly easy to mock as naive and unworkable such a respected, that was easy to mock as naive and unworkable. Such a respected authority just might have offered the stability and rationality missing in our fragmented, fractious society. From Anton Chekhov, Kennan drew an insight pertinent to our post-industrial, post-pandemic society. Chekhov argued that the fundamental source of human misery was not that workers were exploited by their bosses, but rather that human beings in general had made the tragic mistake of relying on impersonal machine production. Industrialism should be viewed as an error, a misunderstanding of how humans needed to relate to each other as well as to their environment. The harm was pervasive, distorting in various ways the lives of bosses as well as of workers. Kennan similarly bemoaned the disappearance of creative handicrafts. He drew attention to the human-oriented arts and technologies forgotten in the ascendancy of electricity, the internal combustion engine, and he would have added the computer. Among the elements unfortunately contained by the containment doctrine was appreciation for the range and the potential utility of Kennan's unconventional thinking. Today, as we again hear talk of containing a dangerous foe, and as we slide toward a new cold, if not hot war with China, and perhaps also Russia, it bears reflecting on the full range of Kennan's thinking. Some of what he thought was prejudiced. Much of it appears impractical, especially at first glance. But here and there shine nuggets of wisdom, which we ignore or ridicule to our own loss. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank. It's now a great pleasure for me to introduce our first commentator, but perhaps before I do that, let me remind our audience that we hope you will join the conversation after the two commentaries and dialogues, and you can do so, and that's our preference, by using the raise hand function. You'll be queued, and then I'll call on you, or you can post your comment to the Q&A function in the Zoom functionality. Then I'll put your questions and comments to our panelists. With that, let's go to Beverly Gage. Welcome back to the Washington History Seminar. Beverly is a professor of 20th century US history. Her courses focus on American politics, government, and societal movements. And her book, G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century, which we featured last fall in the Washington History Seminar, a biography of former FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, was named a best book of 2022 by a long list of journals: the Washington Post, the Atlantic, Publishers Weekly, the New Yorker, the New York Times, Smithsonian, and the list goes on. She is the author of The Day Wall Street Exploded, a story of America in its first age of terror, which examined the history of terrorism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, focusing on the 1920 Wall Street bombing. In addition to her teaching and research, Professor Gage writes for numerous journals and magazines, including the New Yorker, New York Times, and the Washington Post. It's wonderful to have you back to the Washington History Seminar. Zoom room is all yours.
So much. It's great to be back here and to have the privilege of talking about a biography, which is a genre that I've thought quite a lot about in recent years, as you suggest. And so I thought I might direct at least some of my comments in that area. The first thing I want to say for historians out there is that if you flip to the last few chapters of this book, it is not just a book about George Kennan, but is also a book about how historians have contended with Kennan. And a lot of that draws on archival material, Kennan's own commentaries on various historians and figures and previous biographers. So though Frank didn't mention it, there's lots of good gossip in this book for historians who are out there. And reading that part of the book put me in mind of a panel that I did probably about a decade ago now with a couple of my colleagues. One was David Blight, who was then writing a biography of Frederick Douglass. I was in the very early stages of writing my biography of J. Edgar Hoover. And the third panelist was my colleague, John Gaddis, who figures prominently in the latter part of this book as a Kennan biographer. And one of the things that we discovered on that panel was that we each had radically different relationships with our subjects. I was writing about someone that pretty much everyone hated. David was writing about the one figure in American history that at this point everyone sort of loves. And then John had the challenge of writing about someone that he admired, but also someone that he knew, and as Frank writes about, someone who lived a very long time and thus delayed the publication of that biography. And so I think Frank's work is very much in conversation with those earlier biographies. But as I said, it is also a biography that does a lot of reflecting toward the end on the practice of biography and on the biographer's relationship, in this case, quite literally with in Professor Gaddis's case, with the subject. And I was hoping Frank might talk a little bit more about his own relationship to the subject. I saw lots of points of intersection from the experience of being an intellectual and a historian out there on a farm, right, which is a pretty interesting and I think unique experience to be sharing, but also the ways in which your own experience as a historian, maybe also as a farmer and an intellectual, led you to see things in Kennan that I think haven't been highlighted as much before. And I should say, to Frank's credit, that he even includes in the book some back and forth correspondence about his own writing, in particular, an article from a couple of decades ago, and some rather amusing commentary about that. So everyone comes in for comment, including Frank himself. So two other points to make, in addition to just sort of a prod to hear more about your relationship with your subject, in part because in your own biographical writing, emotion, psychology, they play such an important part in how you're describing Kennan's intellectual product. And so I wondered if you could reflect on some of that yourself. But two other points that I wanted to bring out that are a little bit more about your interpretation of Kennan. First, I think as your comments suggested, I took the main point of this book to be, everyone talks about 1946, 47, 48 as containment, the long telegram, X article, and this is what people think of when they think of Kennan. And what this book is trying to do is highlight a whole mostly later, though to some degree earlier period in Kennan's life, when he's articulating a set of ideas that haven't been paid as much attention to, and that in many ways are kind of at odds with the dominant interpretation of containment as a vision for a certain form of Cold War militarism in particular. So I was interested in that, and I was interested in your claim that it is the moments when Kennan is least influential, you seem to be suggesting that he's actually the most insightful. And that seems to me to be a challenge for a biographer, right? If your subject has one moment of intense influence, which in Kennan's case was really pretty short. Now, it's worth saying that this later period, which I'm describing as being less influential, was a period in which any of us could aspire to do what George Kennan did, which was write many books, win 2 Pulitzer Prizes, win the Bancroft Prize, win several National Book Awards, right? So he was no slouch, but nonetheless, it is the late 40s and early 50s when his ideas are put into action. So I was interested in that kind of central claim that it's the period when he doesn't have influence, when in some ways he's not constrained as much by institutions, by policy planning itself, maybe, that he's doing some of his most creative thinking. The second thing that I found interesting was that there seemed to be embedded in that a critique of the idea of grand strategy itself. You quote Kennan himself saying, I don't like this word grand. A little bit of a suggestion that grand strategy might be grandiose strategy sometimes, but that there is a critique to be made of a way of thinking that's symbolized by grand strategy, and you introduced this term unconventional strategy. And so I thought you might expand on the tension there. And then finally, I wanted to suggest that if we take your claim seriously, that it's the period, well, I guess 2 claims. One, that containment became something that Kennan never intended it to be. And that 2, it's the periods when he is actually out of power, sometimes regarded as kind of a crank or an oddball, that he's actually being the most creative and insightful. That led me to think, well, if those things are true, then maybe George Kennan wasn't such a very good strategist after all. Right? If his big idea, containment, turned out to be something where he couldn't anticipate even a couple of years into the future where that idea was going to go, what it was going to enable, and the ways in which he would lose control of it. And then this second category, which is some of his later ideas, which he clearly, and your writing is so evocative on this point, desperately wants to have influence in the world, to be respected, to kind of be back in the thick of things. And yet he utterly kind of fails to do it in any formal policy-making sense. Intellectuals are paying some attention. He's winning book awards, but he doesn't end up with a lot of clout in Washington. And so, would a better strategist have figured out a strategy for putting his ideas into action? So I wanted to throw that out there a little bit as a provocation, and hoping that you can speak more to some of those issues.
Well, thank you, Beverly. It's the short answer is yes. No, that's some very good questions. Okay. So I think, in terms of my relationship with Kennan, and also in terms of, this speaks also to Kennan as a strategist. I think what I tried to do in this book was take Kennan as a package. And because I think his life is significant, and to really understand, you really have to look at how he changed or stayed the same over the course of decades. And I think that's one thing. Another thing is you have to look at the situation, the environment in which Kennan was advocating policy in the late 1940s, and then the situation in which Kennan was advocating policy afterward. Kennan was one reason that I think Kennan was so highly successful in the 46 to 49 period, in the sense he was pushing on an open door. He was advocating containment of the Soviet Union at a time when the Truman administration was already moving in that direction. And in a way, if George Kennan, had never existed, probably the Cold War would have occurred. What he provided was an intellectual justification for policies already in train of being enacted. And also the long telegram, Mr. X, was so beautifully stated that it enabled the State Department, as Chip Bolin put it, to say, we no longer need to consider Soviet national interest. We know how the Soviet Union behaves. And so end of discussion. This is our policy now. We can proceed toward containment. So he's pushing on an open door there. But I also think that with Kennan as a strategist, I think one of Kennan's problems, as he acknowledged, was that he was too persuasive for his own good. When Kennan was trying to make a point, he often exceeded the mark, but going beyond what needed to be proved by stating something so persuasively in such stark terms that he created, in a sense, a problem that he then had to deal with. By trying you have to remember that Kennan wrote the long telegram at a time, as I indicated, when he's stuck in Moscow. He wants to get the hell out of there. He's fed up, with his position in Moscow and U.S. government. And so he overshoots the mark and rings the alarm bell very, very loudly. And then with the Mr. X article, partly to please Secretary of the Navy, then Defense, James Forrestal, he writes a piece which is far more alarmist than he really intends. So he succeeds. It's an open door that he's pushing. He succeeds in implementing containment. And then he's surprised. I mean, this is, you certainly can criticize him for this. He's surprised when Americans, who just waged a total war in Europe and in the Pacific, Americans then respond to this so-called or supposed existential crisis by also building up military force. Well, of course they did, and he should have foreseen that. And I think it's, in a way, Kennan was very self-critical, but it was difficult for him to really criticize himself in basic ways. It is not until, as I said, in just that television interview with Gergen in 1996 that he says, I'm partly to fault. For years and years, the decades, in his memoirs and so forth, he just blames the militarization of the containment as a misinterpretation. Well, he set himself up, and that sentence I read about the fanatical, again, it's an inhuman force, which is threatening the very existence of the United States. Of course, people are going to respond in part with military. I mean, that's naive on his part and disingenuous on his part not to have acknowledged that earlier. Okay. But it's also, as I see Kennan, again, looking at the long view, I see Kennan, I see in a way, the period of the Cold War, the influence from, let's say, 46 to 49 is the anomaly, that in a way, this love affair with the Russian people starts way before and continues afterward. And in a way, if you're going to have this feeling for the Russian people, you can't totally oppose, although he doesn't like the Stalinist regime, but especially after Stalin's gone, you can't totally oppose the Soviet government, because that, after all, is the government in Russia. I mean, opposed in terms of being unsympathetic to the viewpoint. And so I think the continuity there is that Kennan, before this 46 to 49 period and after, is someone who is highly sympathetic to the Russian point of view. In some respects, and I think this is, you can see this throughout the Ukraine, he's a Russian nationalist, and we need to understand him as that, and we can criticize him certainly as that. But that is his viewpoint. I mean, when the Soviet Union was falling apart, finally his prediction came true in 1991, and the old, in a sense, the Russian Empire was falling apart. Kennan was not thrilled at what was happening. So, right. So, okay, then my relationship to Kennan. You know, I have to say that I started thinking about this book in a way, or started thinking about Kennan in the early mid-1990s, and it's like almost 30 years later, and I'm still interested in him. So that says something. So I mean, somehow he strikes a chord with me, the package as a whole, with the prejudice, including anti-Italian American. And he said prejudice. He said after touring parts of Italy, he said he now understood why there's so many problems in New Jersey. So I mean, there's this kind of like, glaring kind of prejudice, anti-Semitism, racism and misogyny and so forth. So that's a lot of baggage. But I guess one reason why honestly, kind of an emotional level and a personal level, I accept that is because Kennan is almost unique, or is unique among the Cold Warriors who helped set up U.S. foreign policy after the Cold War, and having seen that was a mistake. And Kennan is also, in my mind, we need to cut him a lot of slack, so to speak, because he saw continue to see and warn about the threat of nuclear war, which I think is easy to dismiss. I mean, we see that today. It's easy to dismiss because it's so unthinkable. But for Kennan, it remained thinkable, and that fear of that things could get out of hand, and a nuclear war would destroy both Russia and the United States and much of the rest of the world, is something that was in his mind, and that is admirable to me. So I think that's a big part of my reaction to Kennan. I also thought, I mean, John Gaddis's biography is magisterial. There's no question about it, and he had that. As he says, he was companions with George and Adalisa for decades, and that's something no one can replicate. But I think it's also the case that I felt after reading John's book, after reviewing it, I mean, my copy of John's book is falling apart because I've read it so many times and have looked at it in such detail, referred to it over and over again. But I also felt that John's book, there were two things that I thought why Kennan needed another biography. One, I think John's book is wonderful, but it's also, above all, encyclopedic. It's more encyclopedic than it is analytical. And I thought there's a lot of episodes in there where John points to quotes from Kennan's diary or his letter or something, and then leaves it at that. And you get the impression, well, that's George. George is odd in a lot of ways. He's peculiar in certain ways, but I think there's more explanation to be derived. There's more analysis that's a potential there that I try to do. And secondly, I think that as you know, I explore in the book the origins of John's relationship with Kennan, and I think they were a very good fit at the beginning. But in later years, John was less sympathetic with the direction that Kennan was moving in, and I think that the Kennan story, in terms of opposing or being worried about the Cold War, trying to bring about better relations between Moscow and Washington, I felt that story needed to be told with more sympathetic eyes. And finally, I think something that's not in John's book very much or at all is Kennan's record as an environmentalist, as a person who thought about these issues. I mean, it's easy, I think it's so easy to make fun of Kennan. Here's somebody against the automobile. Here's someone who, thinks that is glad when the roads around Princeton ice up and auto travel is stopped for a day. The point is, but yet he saw through some of the problems of the automobile age, of the fact that we're facing a dilemma now, obviously, with not enough room on the roads and so forth. Kennan, or the problem of global warming. So the thing is that I think Kennan, because he has such a wide-ranging intellect, and because he was so emotionally engaged as well as intellectually engaged with so many areas, he had ideas that are worth considering. worth considering. And I think it's, again, easy to make fun of it. It's easy because he thinks otherwise. He's outside the box. But that makes his thinking, I think, that much more valuable. Now, whether, why was he not very influential during the period, from 1950 to 2005? I think that has a lot to do with two things. One, I think that although Kennan was a beautiful writer and won all those book awards, he was not very good at working the bureaucracy. I think he was, he was his own person and didn't suffer fools gladly and didn't like to suck up to people. And secondly, I think one reason he was not that influential in many areas is that American society was not wanting to listen or pay or seriously change the ways we operated, and whether it's foreign policy or domestic policy with regard to transportation and the environment and so forth. He was speaking eloquently, but it was falling upon deaf ears because American society, for the most part, was moving in different kinds of directions.
Great.
So, yeah.
Thank you. Maybe we'll bring Barbara into the conversation now, who's been patiently waiting at the late hour in the UK. Barbara Keys, welcome back to the Washington History Seminar as well. She's a specialist in U.S. and international history, began her teaching career in 2003 after receiving her PhD in history from Harvard. Before coming to Durham, she taught at the University of Melbourne. She's been a visiting scholar at the Center for the Study of Law and Society at UC Berkeley, the Center for European Studies at Harvard, Center for the History of Emotions at the Max Planck Institut für Bildungsforschung in Berlin, and the Leibniz Institut für Europäische Geschichte in Mainz. She's currently finishing not one, but two books, one on Henry Kissinger's legacy and one on the anti-torture campaigns since 1945. Her research and teaching, as Frank mentioned, include areas of human rights, diplomacy, foreign relations, the Cold War in a global perspective, sports. Many of her publications can be found on her website. She's the recipient of the 2010 Stuart Bernath Lecture Prize, awarded by the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations, and the University of Melbourne's 2015 Woodward Medal in Humanities and Social Sciences for a book, Reclaiming American Virtue. She was the 2019 president of the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations, and it's wonderful to have you back, Ara. Zoom room is all yours now.
Thank you, Christian. I'd like to begin by congratulating Frank on what I think is a really marvelous biography, which gave me the sense that Frank had sort of achieved a kind of Vulcan mind meld with Kennan, because there's a real sense of immersion, not only in Kennan's life and work, but I think a depth of understanding of how Kennan's mind operated and his psychology, in addition to, of course, the extraordinary mastery of a really voluminous amount of sources that are part of what makes Kennan such an ideal subject for a biography. And the biography, as I think we've noted, is sympathetic. It's grounded in empathy. It builds on what Beverly noted are some commonalities between Frank and the subject, but it is, of course, also appropriately critical, and in particular of what we think of as Kennan's main accomplishment, the establishment of U.S. Cold War doctrine. I would suggest that as I see it, there are two major contributions the book makes for those of us who are interested in U.S. foreign policy. One is, I think it offers a very compelling explanation of that moment when Kennan does have that influence, a very compelling explanation of how he comes to write the long telegram and then the X article, which relate to his whole history, his personal and professional trajectory vis-a-vis the Soviet Union across the 30s and during the war. And so I think that's a new explanation and a very compelling one. And I think then the second contribution is to look at what happens after that, as Frank has just said, in a more sympathetic light, and to treat much more seriously Kennan's very long efforts to, in a sense, undo what he had done with the long telegram and the X article. And There are numerous episodes that Frank treats differently and better, and gives us new insights into, for example, in 1957, when Kennan gives the Wreath lectures for the BBC, Frank argues that those lectures, he says, they shook the very foundations of the Cold War in the US and the UK. And Frank calls it an achievement that was arguably more impressive than the Long Telegram and the X article, in the sense that the Long Telegram and the X article were sort of almost pushing on open doors, whereas the Wreath lectures were very much pushing against orthodoxy. And in these lectures, Kennan was arguing for starkly reducing nuclear arsenals and offering proposals such as military disengagement from Germany if it were linked to Soviet troop withdrawals from Eastern Europe. And Frank is very good on the public reception of these lectures. Public was very enthusiastic, although, of course, the official reception was icy. And this is one way in which the book gives us a different view of Kennan's very long quest to use diplomacy to secure peace, to reduce the risks of war in the nuclear age. And as Frank has just said, he, in his understanding of Kennan's life, the Long Telegram and the X article are the anomalies, and the steady drumbeat that this book portrays is of Kennan's desire for negotiation and understanding and diplomacy and empathy. And of course, the irony is that, that once Kennan has that moment of influence, he then spends decades, trying to roll back what he has helped to set in motion. He spends decades trying to get the US to disengage from the Cold War. And I think the idea, I love the title. I think the idea that Kennan was between worlds is a very powerful way of thinking about him. And there are lots of worlds in which he was between America and Russia, 20th century and 18th century, cities and farms, his inner life and his public life. I think there's just one other way that's sort of interesting that he might be considered to be between, and that is between thoughts and feelings and words. As we know, and as has already been noted, Kennan was a premier literary stylist. I picked up his first volume of memoirs in thinking about Frank's book and found myself immediately engrossed. I mean, he really does have a very, very compelling way of writing, and it helps explain why he was so influential at the time, and also why he remained visible even when he wasn't in office. And Frank writes a lot about Kennan's gift for reducing complex feelings and emotions and situations to words, as when he was trying to explain Stalin's purges, and he, sat down with these index cards and chronologies in the hopes of being able to distill what was happening into words. So I'd like to throw out 3 questions. One is about this sort of oppositional stance to the Cold War. And as I was reading about Kennan's opposition to the war in Vietnam in Frank's book, Frank has this description of a speech that Kennan gave at Swarthmore in 1968, in which he goes on a rant about perverted youth. So he's sort of on the same side as the anti-war protesters, but he doesn't like America's youth. And this diatribe got coverage in the New York Times. I wondered about the connection between the views that he had that were eccentric or idiosyncratic, like this, and maybe like some of his, before his time environmental views, his distrust of industrial society. A lot of those views would have been private, but some of them did make it into the public sphere, and certainly some of them would be the kind of things that he would have shared now and again with his colleagues. And I wonder if those eccentricities would be another reason why he failed to have influence. So Frank, you've talked about 2 reasons why he didn't have influence, in a lot of influence in his later years. But I wonder if, obviously Kennan had an extraordinary expertise on Russia, but I wonder if official Washington found it easier to ignore him because he had this, he had a feeling, and maybe others had a feeling about him, that he was a man, as you describe, out of his time. Second, I wanted to ask a little bit more about Kennan's views of Russia. And I really think one of the core achievements of the book is the way it captures the complexities of Kennan's relationship, all the different facets of his relationship with Russia. And I remember a talk that you gave, Frank, quite some years ago, in which you were describing the way Kennan was both fascinated with Russia, but also felt blocked from, felt rebuffed. And I think a lot of Russianists, I'm a former Russianist myself, I can really identify with that. But I wonder if you could say a bit more about how Kennan reconciled that sense that he, in some ways was spiritually a Russian or something like that, with some of the views he often expressed, which were more stereotypically negative, like that Russians were primitive. And also, if you might say a bit more about how Kennan saw the Russian future playing out in the 1990s, roughly in the last decade of Kennan's life, maybe into the early Putin years. How did he assess what was happening in Russia in its domestic development? So you talk in the book about his opposition to the expansion of NATO and his concern not to provoke Russian anxiety, but how did he assess what was happening internally? And finally, you write in the final chapters of the book about Kennan's long, deep concern with how he was going to be remembered. You have some descriptions of the horrified reaction he has when historians start with their Cold War revisionism in the late 1960s. You talk about his memoirs, which of course, people always write memoirs to shape how they're remembered. Talk about the relationship with Gaddis. You write about his efforts to control or limit access to his papers at Princeton. And you write, having failed thus far in his obligation to the nation and to humanity, meaning that he has failed to influence things the way he would have wished, Kennan deemed it all the more crucial to extend the potential for his influence beyond his own lifetime. And I wonder if you could tell us a bit about what you think his legacy for today is.
Great, thanks, great questions. Frank, over to you.
Thank you, Ara, for those very generous comments and very good questions. Okay, first of all, Kennan's eccentricities and whether that was the reason why he wasn't taken as seriously as he might have been. Yeah, I think so. I think the biggest eccentricity. I mean, even I think it really undercut his credibility in the U.S. government and basically got him fired from the State Department. And that's pretty significant. Was what happened in Moscow in 1952 when he was ambassador to Moscow. And as I described, I devote a whole chapter to that. He was so basically he was so intent on trying to negotiate some kind of agreement or some kind of easing of tensions with the Soviet government, and he just was stonewalled from the State Department, and Truman just would not give him anything to negotiate with. I mean, they did not want him to negotiate at all, and also was basically stonewalled by the Russian government, so that he was incredibly frustrated, and basically, I think had kind of an emotional breakdown in September 1952 when he's in Berlin's Tempelhof Airport, and he's now in the former Nazi capital. It was the former Nazi capital 7 years earlier, and he makes a comment in which he likens the isolation of American diplomats in Russia to the isolation he suffered when he was interned by the Nazis in early 1942. And he makes that comment in Berlin. And he knew, I mean, as his State Department colleagues commented, Kennan knew that would just be intolerable to the Russians. So in a way, he got himself kicked out. He took an action that basically almost forced the hand of the Soviet government to declare him persona non grata. And then basically Kennan was in the following year, disowned by Truman administration, and even more spectacularly, disowned and fired by the Eisenhower administration with John Foster Dulles. I think after that, Kennan's standing in the U.S. government was severely curtailed. I mean, it was like he was the diplomat who had risen faster than anybody else in his age cohort in the State Department. He had the policy planning staff. I mean, this was the America's premier Russian expert who committed an incredible gaffe, that was, in a way, I think, inexcusable. So that, I think, is something that he never got over in terms of his standing within the U.S. government. And then after, I mean, like you mentioned, the kind of his overreaction to the student protesters at Swarthmore and elsewhere, partly because of the anguish he was suffering in terms of his relationship with his own children, who were part of that kind of youth culture, particularly his son, is kind of over the top. And in Kennan, in typical Kennanish way, he doesn't just give the speech to Swarthmore, but when it generates a lot of protest and letters to him, he collects those letters and talks with people in the New York Times, and they publish it all as a book. I mean, so he's expanding the attention to an incident that was really did not reflect well on him. Then the question about Kennan and Russia's future in the 1990s. As I said, I think he thought Gorbachev was probably the best leader of Russia, of the Soviet Union, in the history of the Soviet Union. He was sorry when Gorbachev was deposed. He was sympathetic with Gorbachev's efforts to reform communism. Kennan was never a real fan of the free market system. He was sympathetic with Gorbachev and was sorry when it all fell apart. And he was worried that the democracy in Russia and capitalism in Russia were on a very precarious basis. And that's part of the reason that, as you said, and I've said, other people have said, why he was against the expansion of NATO. He thought that would just kind of tip the apple cart in a dangerous kind of direction. And then your last comment is about his legacy, how he wanted to be remembered. I mean, can you rephrase that question, actually?
Well, I was actually going to ask, how successful were his efforts to shape how he is remembered? But I guess that I wonder how he is remembered now. Anything you want to say about how we remember him, Frank?
Yeah, right. Okay. Well, I think, the bumper sticker about George Kennan, he was a man of enormous talent. The only thing greater than his talent was his ambition. And part of that ambition was to be influential in many areas of life and to extend that influence when he couldn't see that influence coming to fruition in many areas in the later part of his life, extend that influence in later years. He thought, well, okay, people will pick up his books, 50 years from now, and they'll think, oh, George Kennan, yes, he had good ideas. And that's why it was so important that the biography be done in the right way, by the right person, and not by what he called inadequate pens. So how is he remembered? I think, I'm certainly attuned to this, but I see George Kennan's name on the front page of the New York Times, probably, at least once a month, probably more than that. So, but he's remembered, as I tried to put in the book, he's in a sense contained by the containment doctrine always. He's remembered in the context of containment. I'm sure as it seems if relations with China deteriorate or whatever, I think, and we talked about a new Cold War or whatever, Kennan's name will be invoked in terms of that. He's forever associated with that. And I think, Kennan, as I said, was very ambitious, and in a way he overreached in wanting to shape and determine how he would be remembered in the future. And I'll say, on a personal level, since we're just among the 4 or 5 of us, right? Nobody else is listening. On a personal level, that I guess I felt some kind of like that. I felt I kind of bought into, in a way. I bought into Kennan's ambition, and I thought, well, this guy deserves a biography that takes him more that is more sympathetic. Maybe not better, maybe not better at all, but a biography that takes him more in a more positive way. And it's ironic, of course, because as Beverly pointed out, it wasn't as if Kennan thought highly of me as an historian. So not that we had great contact, but so that's the ironies of things, and yeah.
Thank you. Great conversation. It's such a rich and beautifully written book. I have tons of questions, but I will not, because we have a huge audience and lots of questions, ask my own. But I will, since we're at the Wilson Center, home of the Cold War National History Project and the Digital Archive, I will ask you just to talk for a moment, for those in the audience who do not know, a little bit about the sources of your book. It's such a amazing source base that I think it's worth just talking about it for a minute. And then I'll turn it over to Eric, who has a question before we go to Avis Bolin. Avis Bolin will be the first person to ask a question.
Okay, source basis. Okay, yeah. Well, my wife can tell you that I still have shelves staggering with folders of Kennan stuff. First of all, Kennan himself wrote, there are 330 boxes in Mudd Library of Kennan's material. And he, as an idea of his ambitions and ideas about himself, he actually thought seriously that he or someone should edit this material, publish the 330 boxes of material. So there's that. And included in those boxes are the wonderful interviews that John Gaddis did. I think 7 interviews he did with George Kennan, or 3 with Annalisa, and then with some 30 other interviews that John did with Kennan's colleagues and family, and not his children, but other family members of George Kennan, all kinds of people, most of whom are now deceased. So that's a wonderful source, and we all owe a tremendous amount to John Gaddis for doing those interviews. Also, Joan Kennan did some interviews with Kennan's daughter. There's enormous. Kennan wrote hundreds of speeches. When his secretary said he never gave the same talk twice. I don't think that's quite true, but he wrote hundreds of speeches, which are also available at Mudd Library. There are the books, over 20 books. There's, of course, newspaper articles. But for me, in a way, kind of the neatest archival source is the, I mentioned Kennan and his paying household expenses out of the inheritance of his kids. The only way he was able to do that legally, and it was, of course, legal, the only way he was able to do that was by filing every 6 months a detailed monthly accounting of the money that accrued from George's inheritance of his sisters, and how Kent spent that money. So in the records of the Milwaukee County Probate Court are the detailed financial records. It'd be like the checking your credit card statements today for one of us, of Kent Kennan and his family, and that's a wonderful source. So I guess that's the major part of it.
That's a great teaser. Eric, over to you.
Thank you so much for this. You make on several occasions in the book the observation that in both the Long Telegram and in the X article, Kennan links American foreign policy to the necessity of domestic reform. And I'm struck in reading your book at how, and I'm looking for the right word here, how dense or backwards Kennan is with regard to American society. He doesn't like American democracy. He is incredibly critical of it. He dismisses the New Deal for reasons that I'm not fully sure about. He's a kind of a technocratic authoritarian. He dislikes African Americans, Jews, and immigrants. His industrial ideas, it's not clear how this would work out as we all go back to the land or turn to artisanal production, or whatnot. But when I think about the reform that Kennan seems to be suggesting is essential, it's kind of frightening in some way. So it's as if he doesn't really understand the nation, the country that he's living in. And over time, he doesn't seem to kind of follow events in any way other than kind of digging his heels into his childhood prejudices, which he seems to cling to. So could you talk about Kennan with his insight about matters abroad, and what I guess I would suggest from your book is his lack of insight into American domestic life?
Well, that's a very good point, and a very strong, and I think, in some respects justified criticism. Actually, I think, that one way of looking at the long telegram in the Mr. X article is that they are a focus, and this is somewhat of an exaggeration, but they're directed, the objective of those two documents, in a way, and there's an exaggeration, but the objective of those two documents is to have an impetus for domestic reform, as he sees it, domestic reform, with foreign affairs as the justification. Now, the reason I say that is that Kennan, in earlier writings in the 30s and in the 40s, talked about what he said. I'll speak specifically about this in a minute. What he saw as the necessity for domestic change in the United States, and he used various justifications for why that was necessary. And then when he does, then he significantly finished up long telegram Mr. X by calling again for domestic reform. Okay, I think Kennan, as he would probably argue, what he felt was that American society was too individualistic, too commercially oriented, too superficial in terms of being focused on advertising, mass media, that Americans were too selfish, and there wasn't enough pulling for the common good. And that's one of the reasons he thought he exaggerated. One of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons he exaggerated the nature of the Soviet threat was to emphasize the importance of everyone pulling together. And that's what he says at the end of the long telegram in Mr. X. So as to why he was oblivious to many aspects of American history, well, for the first part of his life, he lived most of it overseas. When he came back to the United States for kind of just a year or so in 1937, 38, was at the low point of the New Deal. Franklin Roosevelt's, was struggling. Government was struggling because of the downturn of 37, 38. So the accomplishments of the New Deal didn't seem to be there. Kennan came from a Republican family. He faulted FDR. This is a petty thing, but he faulted FDR for the pay cut in 1933. Was never really simpatico with Franklin Roosevelt. I think he met Roosevelt twice. Roosevelt rubbed him the wrong way. Probably Kennan rubbed Roosevelt the wrong way. And then of course the prejudices which you enunciate, which are deplorable. I mean, against immigrants, against African Americans, the misogyny and so forth. As I said a few minutes ago, Kennan's a package. And I think people react to this package either, justifiably saying, this guy's a weirdo, I don't want to have anything to do with him, or, he is overrated, or people see him as someone who's deeply flawed and yet has the overall package is positive. I see it, again, for reasons of wanting to ease tensions with Russia and head off a nuclear war. I see that as overriding and excusing other things, but I certainly can see where people don't agree with that.
Thank you. Let's get to our audience. Let me first call on Ambassador Avis Boland. If you could unmute yourself, please.
Okay. Thank you, Christian. And I guess I don't seem to have a picture. Well, anyway, Frank, thank you so much for a fascinating lecture. And I've already started reading your book and look forward to continuing. I have two sort of comments. First of all, the long telegram. It's really not only that official Washington sort of took the ball and ran further down the field and militarized Soviet American foreign policy to a degree Kennan didn't want, but his own language is partly to blame for this. He used a very sort of categorical language about the Soviet Union, this, absolutely hell-bent on world conquest and everything, which is more more reminiscent of what Paul Nitze wrote in the NSC 68 than what Kennan really thought about Russia and about Soviet foreign policy. And I wonder if you'd sort of comment on that. It's his language is so extreme, and of course it represented a view that no, it was not his, but that was Nitze's and Atchison's, and which was the source of a long dispute with later. And the second thing is about the Reith lectures. This was an idea that he had been pushing starting in 1948. And it's not really so much about diplomacy, it's about his vision of what Europe should look like, which just didn't happen to be what the Europeans themselves wanted, starting with the Germans. I mean, they did not want to be part of a demilitarized zone in the middle of Europe, to be singularized, which is almost like a cuss word in German diplomacy. And of course, you couldn't have gotten to the outcome that he was talking about without diplomacy. But I wonder if it's not just as much his own devotion to this idea, which he just wrote about endlessly.
Thank you. Frank, if you could keep the answers short and succinct, since
thank you. It was first of all, it's a pleasure seeing you. Hearing you. Okay, so yeah, I agree 100% in terms of the long telegram. The language was extreme, and for reasons I indicated before. He wanted to make a point. He wanted to gain the attention. And I think what was significant in terms of the impact of the long telegram was your father's comment, which was, okay, now we no longer have to worry about considering what Soviet national interests. We know how to behave toward the Soviet Union. I mean, that was Chip Boland's conclusion that I think was from the long telegram that was significant. Secondly, I'm sorry, I have to dispute you a little bit about the reaction to the Reith lectures. The press comment, at the time, the reporting from the German, reporting back to Bonn by German diplomats, reporting back to London by American, reporting back to London by British diplomats, talked about the huge public reaction in West Germany, as well as in Britain and in other countries, to the idea that maybe there was an alternative to the stationing of nuclear weapons in Germany, to the worsening of the Cold War, which, many Europeans understandably thought, well, okay, if it's absolutely necessary that we have to endure the risks of annihilation, well, then so be it. But Kennan was saying there was an alternative, which of course would have to be negotiated. And that's always Kennan's view, that there would have to be a mutual, rather than a unconditional Soviet surrender in the Cold War, there'd be a mutual withdrawal, mutual agreement to ease tensions and have a pullback. There was a lot of sentiment. I mean, what I've seen, and diplomats were worried. Establishment diplomats and people in foreign offices were worried because there was such a positive popular reaction. And Khrushchev himself publicly said Kennan's ideas are workable.
Thank you. We'll go next to Michael Keyes, the Wilson Center State Department Fellow. Michael, let's try it this time. See if we can get you unmuted. You're still muted.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear
Okay.
you. Great.
Great. This is really great. Thank you very much. Maybe if you could just answer maybe one of these questions, that'd be great. Is there anything about influence of his religion on his worldview, or do you cover maybe his views on the CIA or the attacks on the China hands and how that affected him, or how he viewed the Foreign Service as a career? Over.
Okay. Well, in terms of religion, he's a person who started out in college, like I guess many college students, as an atheist or agnostic. Religion became very important to him later in life. I mean, in the 80s, when he, thought he basically had tried to empathize how God would feel in reacting to human foibles. But the religion was not important in terms of during the foreign policy phase. when he was certainly active in foreign policy. In terms of the CIA, I really don't have a lot. The book has some stuff in there, but it doesn't really have a lot to add. What John and others have written about Kennan's involvement with the CIA and operations in Albania and so forth, which Kennan regarded as part of the pressure to try to get the Soviets to negotiate a pullback from Eastern Europe. But he also said that his involvement with the CIA was the worst mistake he ever made in government.
Thank you. Jeffrey Herf is next. Jeff, please unmute yourself.
Okay. Frank, first of all, I share John Gaddis's view about the benefits of containment in Europe and Japan, but I also want to congratulate you on a book from which I have learned an enormous amount from one historian to another. So thank you and congratulations. I have three short questions. One, it concerns issues that Beverly Gage also raised, and that is about the violation of privacy in writing a biography. Reading your book made me wonder that it might be a very bad idea for anybody to write a diary. And that there are things that we learn about George Kennan's personal life that are really, I think, none of my business. I would imagine you've thought about that. There's a popular, of course, interest in such books, but I actually would rather know less about his private life. Second is his views about Germany and about the Jews. As you do mention that he opposed the establishment of the State of Israel, you don't mention that he also opposed the Nuremberg war crimes trials. And I think that his understanding of Germany and post-war Germany left a great deal to be desired. And when he had advocated disengagement from Europe, he doesn't seem to have reflected on the possibility that disengagement would have strengthened the forces of neo-Nazism in West Germany. And third, I think about 30 years of his life was spent in the Foreign Service, I think, and 50 years were spent at the Institute for Advanced Study. So for most of his life, he was a professor, one of the most privileged professors, no blue books, no exams, no students in the United States. But you don't talk about the Institute for Advanced Study and the possible impact that J. Robert Oppenheimer and Michael Walzer and Peter Perret may have had on him. And I think about that because I met Kennan in 1995 when I was a fellow at the Institute. And I was working on the anti-Semitic purges of the 1950s. And the great man could not have been more gracious and warm. The Kennan that I met seemed to me a very different man than the man that Eric described so well, with his views of Jews and Italians and Black and Afro-Americans and the like. In other words, I wonder if the Institute for Advanced Study and the 50 years he spent there changed him. But again, my congratulations. It's a very gripping book, even with my disagreements.
Okay, thank you, Jeffrey. And I liked your book as well too, and I used it some, and it came out just as I was finishing up this book. First of all, in terms of the diary, well, Kennan intended his diary to be read by others. He intended his diary to be read by others. He also very carefully remained elliptical and allusive as to the details of many aspects of his private life. I mean, there are no names named, and as I said, he intended his diary to be read. And one of the things he had discussions he had with John Gaddis is whether John would be able and would be interested in covering his private life. And that's something he thought was necessary. So I did not feel I was intruding beyond what the bounds that Kennan himself set. With regard to his being personally courteous, I mean, I think almost everyone who met Kennan said that he was highly, warm to most people, and I think was very, very generous in his personality, especially on a personal basis. With regard to the Germany and possibly neo-Nazism, I don't think Kennan didn't think that was really a likely. Perhaps he was wrong, but he did think that was a likely possibility in a reunified Germany. I agree that I probably should have covered Kennan's reaction to the Nuremberg trials, where which I think he regarded that as Kennan was against unconditional surrender of Germany. He thought that was one of the problems leading to the problem of containing the Soviet Union. Germany and Japan had been totally defeated, and he thought that was, from his point of view, that was a violation of the national sovereignty, having that kind of trial after the war was over. So that was his view. However we regard it, that was his view.
Thank you. Svetlana Savronskaya is next. Go ahead. Looks like you're unmuted. So. But we can't hear you. We'll try again in a minute. Steve Brady, please unmute yourself.
Hi. Thanks very much. I have a really quick question, which is, and I haven't read the book. I will, though. This has been fascinating. I have a tendency, not being someone who knows anywhere near as much about George Kennan as you, to have viewed him as somebody who always seemed to need to be the intellectual outsider. And so I'm just wondering, what kind of, do you see continuity or discontinuity more in his thinking, especially about foreign relations? And is there anything to that idea that he always had to view himself as being a misunderstood genius?
Thank you.
I think it's probably easy to see him that way. I don't think that was what was motivating him. I think he wanted to be, rather than the misunderstood genius, he wanted to be seen, he wanted to be the influential policymaker. He didn't want to be on the outside. I think it had to do with that his being on the outside had to do with the juxtaposition of his ideas and the reception of those ideas and the status of position, opinion in American society and the American government. Now, he wanted to be having influence rather than on the outside.
Thank you. Matthew Fink, please unmute yourself. There you go.
I was curious what his attitude, you read a lot about Kennan, his anti-communism, his concern about the Soviet Union. What did he think about Nazi Germany? He was stationed there in the late 30s. What were his fears or non-fears?
Well, actually, I think this is one way we can grounds for criticizing Kennan. He at first thought when the Germans moved into Czechoslovakia, he at first thought, and even in 1940, early 40, he thought, well, okay, now here's the chance to use German energy and organization to create a common European market. I mean, that we can integrate the European economy, and hopefully the Germans will be responsible and not be too heavy-handed. But he quickly became disillusioned as he realized the brutality that was part of the German occupation. But he was not a fan of the Versailles Treaty, and I think initially was willing more than a lot of people in Washington to see German hegemony as potentially not a terrible thing.
Thank you. The final question, I'm afraid, will go out. This is not a mistake. Go to Jim Hirschberg. Jim, keep it short.
Okay, I believe I'm unmuted now, and I'll be very short. I'm looking forward to reading the book, Frank. And I want to ask about something I was dissatisfied by the way John handled the story, and it hasn't come up much today. And the question basically revolves around your sense of how strongly he opposed the Vietnam War, because of course his testimony to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and his openly stating that the intervention in Vietnam was not required by containment lent a lot of intellectual force to the anti-war movement. But as was mentioned, he was not very favorable about the student protesters. So compared to his feelings about the nuclear danger, environmental issues. How emotionally, how important was his opposition to the escalation in Vietnam?
I think it was very important. And it's important to keep in mind here that it's the manner and as he saw it, the manner and style of the anti-war protesters that he objected to, not the content of what they were saying. I mean, he saw, he came out in favor of the nomination of Eugene McCarthy. Be clean for Gene was very much in keeping with George Kennan's view that anti-war protesters should be respectful, wear ties and jackets ideally, but not, he's not in favor of the Abbie Hoffman approach. And that was his objection to the students of Swarthmore, not the content of their protests, but the form and manner.
Thank you. I'm afraid we'll have to bring this to a close. We like to keep it to 90 minutes or so. Lots more questions, also lots more comments. We'll try to capture those and pass those on to Frank. Clearly, we could have gone on for a couple more hours. Frank, thank you so much for this, and also Bev and Ara, and of course, Eric. Let me turn to Eric for final words.
My thanks to all of you as well. We want to invite everyone back to join the Washington History Seminar next week on Monday, February 13th for our session on Heather Hendershot's When the News Broke, Chicago 1968 and the Polarizing of America, with discussants Michael Kazin and Samantha Barbas. Till then, take care. Good night.